Thank you all for joining us this snowy evening. Hopefully, you're all safe and sound and staying inside. Leave it to Wisconsin to snow again in March, and I'm sure we'll get another round as well. But thank you again for joining. My name is Justin Ladowick, and I am a 2017 grad working in Carroll's alumni office. So if you haven't heard my name or seen me on campus yet, as you graduate, you definitely will. We love to keep our alumni engaged in many different ways, from social opportunities to networking to activities and more. So definitely your Carroll adventure, if you will, does not end after graduation, continues as alumni for life. So again, thanks for tuning in. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren and then let the two of them take it from here.
Yeah. Well, everybody on this call knows who I am, but I will introduce myself for anybody who watches later. I am Lauren Herod-Wampler. I graduated in 2017. I currently work for the College of Arts and Sciences. I am the administrative assistant for the honors program and the music department. Super excited to have Noah Foster here with us to talk about voting and all things voting. Noah is a former honor student. He reluctantly joined the Honors Council in his last year at Carroll. And I think it ended up being a really great decision for him. We're really excited that he did it because I don't think I would have him here with me today to talk about his job and the thing that he is really passionate about. So thank you so much, Noah, for being here and for giving into the call of being on the Honors Council. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk about what you do?
Thank you, Lauren. And yeah, thanks for throwing me under the bus with the reluctance part. I wish I could deny it, but it's true. But it is true that ultimately I think it was like a good decision. I enjoyed my time on the council. So first off, just thank you to Justin and Lauren for having me here to talk to you all about voting and especially what voting kind of looks like in all of y'all's lives as college students and young alumni and future graduates. So, as Justin Lawrence said, my name is Noah Foster, and I graduated with the Carroll class of 2022, so just this past spring. And I graduated with a double major in political science and history, and then a minor in philosophy, where I really developed a lot of passion for politics. And during my junior and senior year at Carroll, I was actually an intern with Campus Vote Project. And I was there for all 4 semesters of those 2 years. And I did a lot of work that I really enjoyed. And then when it came time for graduating, I was thankfully offered a full-time position as the Deputy State Coordinator of Wisconsin for Campus Vote Project. So Campus Vote Project is actually a sub-organization of a DC-based law firm called the Fair Election Center. The Fair Election Center is a nonpartisan organization made up of a team of lawyers that basically handle most major litigation that deals with election protection. So we've done a lot of lawsuits in federal courts all over the country and even like in the Supreme Court. Like currently, FEC is actually in the Supreme Court battling new North Carolina law. So that's really interesting. But while they were doing all this, they quickly realized that one of the most disenfranchised group of voters that actually saw the most legal barriers consistently was college students. So they decided to, in 2012, create the Campus Vote Project, where we are responsible for hiring and training students all across our states to oversee civic engagement on their campus. So like for me specifically here in Wisconsin, I currently employ 35 students spread out all over Wisconsin from Superior down here to Carroll. And those students engage in a vast variety of projects on their campus to promote civic engagement. So that's kind of what I do. So the first thing I want to talk about is this question that we hear a lot, which is, why should I vote? We hear this a lot, especially from college students. Overall, I would say voting in America is pretty has some pretty dismal numbers, but especially among college students, it's really, really bad. This past fall, we heard a lot about record-breaking numbers, and those record-breaking numbers were a grand old 27% turnout, um, which, good on us for breaking records, but like, is it really an accomplishment if the record sucked in the first place? Is kind of my opinion with that. Which is why we do this work, because we want to get those numbers as close to like the national average as possible. In an ideal world, we get it above the national average, but we've got a long way to go with that. And as in this current position, but especially when I was an intern in college, I would just hear a lot of people who just like didn't want to vote, and they didn't see why they should vote or why their vote mattered or why it was important. You hear the same rhetoric over and over again. And so the big 3 points that I try and touch on with this is, first, that it's a habitual thing. I hear a lot from college students about how they just don't think it's an important right now in their lives, and they'll do it when they're older. And unfortunately, this is easier said than done. There's been a lot of studies done that show that voting is an extremely habitual action. And every single year that you don't vote, you are significantly less likely to ever vote in your life. And the first time someone votes, basically will seal the deal on them being an at least consistent voter in important elections. Breaking that ground on local elections has always been a little bit of a challenge, but once we can get a person to vote for the first time, they are very likely to be a lifetime voter. And so that's why we want to start it as soon as possible when you're 18 and likely in college. Also, elections just matter. A lot of people like to pretend that they don't, but they do. Especially as you graduate college. I get it, how it can be kind of hard to sell the importance of it to a college student. But think about all the things that you are going to encounter immediately after you graduate that are going to be important, especially in just like local elections, right? Things that you don't consider, such as who takes care of your garbage disposal. These things are determined by your city council, and you get to choose who sits on that city council. I would be surprised if a single person in this entire call could tell me who their city council member is. Truthfully, I can't right now. I know it's a woman. I can't tell you her name off the top of my head. And like, that's unfortunate that we have this mindset with local elections, because these decisions do impact your daily life. Think about like school board elections, for example. We have school board elections in a lot of municipalities across the state on April 4th. A lot of you are going to be working in schools. A lot of you are going to be sending your children to schools, and how those schools run is going to be determined by the school boards of those school districts, and you get to choose who sits on those school boards. Those aren't things that you think about right now in college because they don't directly impact you, but they will very soon. So that's why I highly recommend starting voting as soon as possible, because these things matter. And of course, we could go to the, big time problems too that matter just as much, if not more, such as, abortion, gun rights, you name it. Those issues matter to a lot of people too, and those absolutely can be impacted by your vote. And then the last thing I like to bring up, which is a little bit more pessimistic, is that whether you like it or not, your interests will be represented whether or not you vote. I think a lot of people almost have this like protest mindset where they're going to protest and not vote, and they think that this is funny or something. But at the end of the day, a person is going to fill the office. A person is going to get elected, and they will make decisions about your life, and they don't care if you sat out or not. Like it's just how it is. If your interests are going to be represented for years, you might as well have a say in how those decisions get determined. You can go to the next slide, Justin. All right, so what is the April 4th election? Hopefully, most of you have heard that there's an election coming up. April 4th is the general election day for the state of Wisconsin. And unfortunately, not a lot of people are talking about it. A lot more people than honestly I originally anticipated. But there's a lot of people that are still don't know a lot about it. So what is this election? Honestly, it depends. It depends a lot on where you're at. There's a ton of local, really small elections that are only going to be specific to like counties, cities, or certain municipalities. So the first thing I would encourage you to do, which I'll explain a little bit later about how you can do this, but is go find a sample ballot. These are all over the place. They're easily accessible. They're out right now. And you can see exactly what's going to be on your ballot. So that way there's no surprises when you walk into your polling station on April 4th. Some of you are only going to have one race. Everyone's going to have at least one race, but a lot of you are going to have multiple races. So definitely look into that before you go vote. But the one race that everybody is talking about and everyone will have on their ballot is the Wisconsin Supreme Court. So this is the one statewide election that is happening on April 4th, and it is down between two candidates, Daniel Kelly and Janet Protasewicz, and the winner of that will sit on the Wisconsin Supreme Court after this election is over. So why should you care specifically about this race? Well, first off, it's actually a privilege that we get to vote for this office. You don't get a vote for the Supreme Court of the United States. That's an appointed office. The fact that we actually get to vote for our state Supreme Court candidates is really freaking cool. And I would take advantage of that because it's just as important of a seat as the US Supreme Court, which everyone hears about and talks about. First off, it's a 10-year position. The person who wins this race will sit on there until 2033. Which sounds like a long ways off because it is. So please, consider that. This is a very long-term position and they will be making a lot of really important decisions. Almost certainly, for example, we are going to see a vote on the 1849 abortion law in Wisconsin. Also, in 2030, new maps are going to be drawn for the state of Wisconsin. I'm not sure how many of you pay attention to things like redistricting and gerrymandering, but these are extremely important issues that determine a lot of how politics in Wisconsin look. And the Supreme Court is the one that ultimately gets to decide on those issues. And this candidate will be around for the next round of maps that are drawn for our state. Similarly, they'll be deciding on a lot of not as flashy decisions, but really important ones. There's a lot of debate right now over unions, the status of unions in Wisconsin. That'll almost undoubtedly be something that will come across the Supreme Court during this next cycle. And the last time we had a Supreme Court election in 2019, it was extraordinarily close. All Wisconsin elections are going to be super close. It's just how we are in this state. We are by far one of the, probably, I would argue, the most purple state in the country. Maybe Georgia has this beat right now, but we've been doing it for a lot longer than they have. And in 2019, when we had a Supreme Court race, it came down to less than 6,000 votes. I think it was like 5,800 votes. That's smaller than the entire population of UW-Milwaukee. The entire student population of UW-Milwaukee. That's barely bigger than Carroll University. And honestly, I would argue that we've only become more purple since 2019. So it's not unlikely that this election will come down to a vote count smaller than the entire student population of Carroll, which is ridiculous to think about. So if you're one of those people where you're like, my vote doesn't actually matter because it's not going to come down to one vote, you know what? You're probably right. It's probably not going to come down to one vote, but it'll be a hell of a lot closer than a lot of other races we've seen. And it's not unreasonable to think it comes down to a handful of people. And like I said, the Wisconsin Supreme Court is not going to be the only thing on your ballot. There probably will be other smaller elections where it really can come down to a handful of votes. We saw a primary election in Wisconsin just back in February come down to less than, I think it was 63 votes exactly, which is crazy small. So these margins are definitely they're definitely something that like a few votes can make a big difference. So yeah. So perfect. I've sold you on voting. So now how do you vote? So this QR code here will take you to a website called My Vote Wisconsin. You can scan it or you can just look it up. But this is the holy grail of Wisconsin politics. We are lucky to have one of the best voting websites in the country, and anything you could ever want to know about Wisconsin elections can be found on this website. So for example, you can look at your sample ballot on this website, which I was talking about earlier. But the actual process of voting, this website walks you through super well too. So first, you have to register to vote. In Wisconsin, we are very lucky that we have same-day voter registration. So if you walk into your polling location on April 4th and you haven't registered to vote, you can do so at the polling location. I personally would recommend trying to register in advance if you can. And the reason I recommend that is because it's more difficult to register to vote than to vote itself. And if you walk into your polling location at 7:30 p.m. on election night when polls close at 8 o'clock and you don't have everything you need to vote, and they send you home to go get something you're missing, such as like a proof of residence, for example, and you didn't know you needed that, you might not make it back to the polls in time to register and vote. So that's why I recommend registering beforehand. And once you've registered, you're good to go. And if circumstances change, such as you change addresses, all you have to do is update your registration at that point, which is a little bit less difficult. So yeah, you can do this completely online if you meet the right circumstances. Unfortunately, a lot of people aren't able to register online. For example, if you don't have a Wisconsin driver's license, you won't be able to register online, unfortunately, but you can still register in advance. At like your county clerk's office, for example. The deadline to register to vote online is coming up pretty soon. It's March 15th. But like I said, don't let that stop you because you can register at the polls on election day. Just make sure you know everything you need to bring in advance to do that. You also can vote in a lot of different ways too. Everyone just thinks about walking in to the polls on April 4th and casting their ballot at one of those booths. But there are several other options too. For example, you can request a ballot gets mailed to you, and then you can just mail it back, and you never have to leave your own home. This is called absentee voting by mail. Luckily, in Wisconsin, we can do it no excuse. A lot of other states require you to have a valid reason to vote by mail, but not in Wisconsin. So if that's something you want to do, you totally can. You can also sign up for a ballot to always be mailed to you. If you can request for an absentee ballot by mail for every election to be sent to your address, which is super convenient too. So in case you forget about voting, it'll be mailed to you anyway. You can also absentee vote in person. This is personally what I tend to do the most often. So you'll want to confirm with your clerk because clerks get a little bit of freedom as to when they have absentee voting in person, but you can go to your county clerk's office, usually between this election, March 21st and April 2nd. April 3rd is called a dead window, so there's no voting on April 3rd. but March 21st to April 2nd, typically, you can go to your county clerk and you can vote on your own time, and you don't have to worry about voting April 4th, and you don't have to deal with the mail either if you want to do it in person. So that is definitely an option. Or obviously, you can go to the polls on election day. Polling locations will be open 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And as long as you are in line by 8 p.m., you can vote. This is another thing a lot of people don't know. They always hear you have to vote before 8 p.m. It's a very common thing people like to throw out, and they'll be standing in line because everyone rushes to the polls last minute. And then they're like, oh, it's 8 o'clock, I didn't get a vote, and they'll leave. But as long as you're in line, you can still vote. We saw some lines go as long as 2 a.m. in the fall. So my recommendation, if you don't want to wait in that long of a line, is one, probably don't live in a super populated place like Madison, but also vote ahead of time, because you have several opportunities to do so, and you don't know what April 4th is going to look like. Something really bad could happen, or it could just be a crazy day, terrible weather, and you just ultimately decide it's not worth it. So another reason to vote in advance. And the last thing I like to tell people is, if you think you can't vote, you are probably wrong. Not always. For example, if you're not a U.S. citizen, you can't vote. Sorry. But a lot of people have misconceptions about reasons they might be prohibited from voting. For example, the one I hear all the time, which we don't know how to push this any more than we already do, is if you are from a different state, you can still vote in Wisconsin. If you are an Illinois resident and you're going to school at Carroll, you can vote here. All you have to do is have resided here for the past 28 days, which I'm guessing, if it's April 4th on spring semester, you probably lived here for 28 days. So that is not a reason to not vote. Also, if you've registered and voted at a different location before, you can still vote where you currently reside. I hear a lot of people where they're like, oh, I originally was from Madison. I registered and voted a couple times in Madison. I just don't want to drive all the way back to Madison to vote, so I'm just not going to vote. It's like, well, you can re-register here at your current address. College students, by federal law, have the capability to vote either at their original place of residence that they grew up in, or where they're currently residing at college. We're one of the few groups of people that get an opportunity like that. So take advantage of that, and don't let that be a barrier that keeps you from voting. If you are worried you don't have a valid form of ID, I promise you can get one. There is an amazing organization called Vote Riders that will pay any amount of money necessary to provide you with a voting ID. So if that's a concern of yours, there are solutions. There's, if transportation to the polls is something that concerns you, again, there's online options. There's also organizations that will transport you to the polls as well. Basically, anything that you think might be keeping you from voting can probably be overcome. So that's kind of my last thing with that.
I would just like to throw two things in there for students. In the chat right now, I am sending a link. Carroll really supports voting and civic engagement for students. So there's a website that talks a lot about, it's a Carroll site here that talks about your polling place based off of which residence hall you live in, and then some of the other topics that Noah has highlighted here. So whether you scan the QR code that he put in here, I checked it out, fantastic site, or use Carroll's resources. All the information you need is right there to make it easier for you guys. And then in regard to polling place, if you can't find a ride, don't quote me on this, but I feel like they offered public safety shuttles. Did they? Yes, I'm getting some head nods. So I'm pretty sure public safety can take you to your polling place. If not, call me, I'll take you. Call Lauren, she'll take you. There are plenty of staff and faculty that would love to help you get to your polling place if for some reason you cannot. So I just wanted to throw that in there while we were kind of talking about that topic.
Yeah, I believe public safety will take you to all the polling locations currently. Polling locations do change occasionally. And I feel like we only ever had a problem with like one location, but it got figured out. Also, there's students that work for Campus Vote Project on campus. I'm pretty sure there's one in the room right now. I won't call her out. But they should also be available to help you out with any of that stuff as well. So yeah, there's definitely solutions. So the last thing I kind of want to talk about is just briefly how else you can get involved outside of just voting. So the three quick things are just, first off, spread the word. The biggest barrier we have to overcome in this election is just not enough people knowing about it. So just tell your friends, tell your family, tell everyone you can about the election, remind people about it, spread the word, share stuff on social media, etc. A lot of like national news organizations have been calling this the most important race in the country. I'm biased, but I would probably agree. And it's also the most well-funded. We have, with a month left to go, the two candidates have already broken the all-time record for state Supreme Court spending for advertisements. So there's definitely a lot of resources out there talking about this election that you can like share around. So don't be afraid to do that. You can also become a poll worker. This is something I would highly recommend for college students. It's just good experience. It's a paid opportunity. There's always a need for poll workers. It'll get you out of class for the day. I guarantee you there's no professor that's going to throw a fit if you say I have to miss class because I'm serving as a poll worker. And like the average age of poll workers is like 85. And as you know, as races become more like technology based, it's really useful, and chief election inspectors really like having younger poll workers. We also tend to be more fluent in like other languages, which is really good for voters that don't have English as their first language. So that's just always something I encourage people to do. You can also volunteer as a poll observer. So anyone can walk into any polling location, seek out the chief election inspector and say, I just want to act as a poll observer. And depending on why you might, there's a lot of different reasons why someone might do this. I would recommend it for if you are really passionate about voting and civic engagement and you're worried that some people might be getting disenfranchised. Poll observers can just make sure that anyone who might be told that they can't vote for a certain reason, they can like talk to them and, help them figure out a potential solution, or just to like make sure that the entire process is working like according to the law and stuff like that. So those are kind of the best ways you can get involved outside of voting itself, but voting itself will always be the most important. So that's kind of the end of my little presentation there. So I'll kind of open it up to anyone who has any questions.
Feel free to unmute yourselves or use the chat. Either one is totally fine.
One thing I wanted to mention when you were talking about the IDs, the Campus Center Info Desk actually will print voting IDs for free. All you have to do is just say, hey, I want to get an ID, and they'll do that.
Yep. So that's that's actually something I should briefly touch on. So currently student IDs do not count as a valid form of voter ID unless they meet specific criteria. And I don't know the exact wording of how the law goes, but there is a law that requires schools to be able to provide at least some free form of valid voter ID to their students. So if you go to the Carroll, the main desk in the campus center, and ask for a voter ID, they will print you one for free that you can use. So yeah, that's definitely something I would suggest if you don't have a valid form of ID.
All right, I have a question, Noah. I'm a college student and I think voting is cool and I want to go vote, but all of my friends are like, really? Like, is it worth it? Why should I go vote? The things that you were saying earlier, those kind of stigmas. How can I get my friends interested in going to the polls with me? Or just in general, doesn't have to be with me, but just how can I help my peers get interested in voting?
Make sure you tell them that they get a free sticker at the end of it that they can post on their social media. That's super motivating. But no, in reality, I would say just make it as relatable to them as possible. Everyone has their thing, right? Like everyone has their thing that they really care about and that they're passionate about. And there's nothing that someone can care about that doesn't relate to politics in some way or government. And if you can just let them know that, or, find that argument that convinces them that, the thing that they care about can be impacted by these elections and that their vote can actually influence these things that they care about, that can be a super motivating factor. So that's kind of always what I would recommend doing, because until people are given a reason to vote, they won't, which is valid, right? Like if it was a completely meaningless activity, I wouldn't suggest anyone doing it. But giving them a reason is always going to be my first recommendation.
How do you counter the argument that people always have about the Electoral College basically making the decisions, and that makes it seem like our vote doesn't matter during federal elections?
The first thing I would say is that the Electoral College, the Electoral College only determines one race. Any complaints that someone has about the Electoral College, I'm going to say are valid, but at the end of the day, they only determine one race, and that's the presidency every 4 years. There are tens of thousands of other races that happen all across the country at all different levels of government that the Electoral College has no say in. If someone votes in all those, thousands of elections that they'll experience throughout their lives, and they choose to opt out of just the presidential election because they don't like the Electoral College, that's fine by me. I would consider that a win.
I have a follow-up question. Really going to test your knowledge here. I have we'll call it a kindergarten level of knowledge of the Electoral College, right? Like I kind of get it. I've maybe talked about it in greater detail once or twice in my life, but I bet a lot of other people here also are at that kindergarten level. Can you give us like a 5th grade level, maybe not to what so that we don't get totally lost, but can you give us like that a little bit more of how that works? I know it's not applicable for this election, but on the topic of voting, it is. And anything else you could give us on that, how it works or how it came to be or whatever?
Yeah. So, how it came to be is actually like a really interesting story. So basically, when originally the founding fathers created a federal form of government under something called the Articles of Confederation. And that was our original constitution, and it sucked. It was a disaster. It was terrible. It didn't even last a decade. And what all the founding fathers basically got together and they shut themselves in a courthouse, and they refused to leave until they came out with something better. And they were just pumping out all kinds of stuff for creating this new country, including our constitution that we still have. But nobody could solve the question of how do we pick our president. So they had a little group of people that they shoved all of their kind of miscellaneous stuff that they didn't know what to do to them. And they just said, come up with something and we'll figure out something later. And this group came up with the Electoral College, and it has stuck around since. And basically what happens is your state gets a certain number of electoral college votes depending on your representatives plus your total number of senators. So the smallest number is 3, because every state has at least 2 senators and 1 representative. And then obviously can grow from there. So what basically happens when you vote in a presidential election is you vote and your state looks at the total number of votes and goes, okay, Wisconsin has picked Joe Biden as their winner for the presidential election. And the Wisconsin legislature, typically by law, then decides they're going to send a number of delegates to the Electoral College based on the number of delegates that they get to vote for the presidency. So then those delegates, ideally, and almost always without fail, will vote for the person that the constituents in their state voted for. And yeah, so that's kind of the basics of how that works. I think the problem where that, like, the two concerns people have about the Electoral College is one, it's very disproportionate from state to state. So for example, if you live in Montana, right, or Wyoming is always the best example, you get 3 Electoral College votes because every state has to have at least 3 Electoral College votes. They are the most powerful voting bloc in the country because they have the most people, they have the, how would you say that? Like their proportion of people to Electoral College votes is the smallest that exists in the country. Whereas like with California, their votes matter significantly less because of their proportion of Electoral College delegates to their voters. So that's kind of where the complaint comes in with that. And then likewise, there's also the question, which is actually increasingly becoming a question and may be relevant for the Supreme Court, which is, does the legislator have to send delegates that represent the wishes of their constituents? So for example, the North Carolina bill that we're currently battling in the Supreme Court raises the legal question of the independent delegates. And this is the idea that a legislator can go, you know what, our state voted for Donald Trump, but we as a legislative body in the majority don't like Donald Trump, and we want to send delegates that are going to vote for Joe Biden and say, screw our voters. A lot of legislators are currently bound by law not to do so, but laws can change. So that's the next concern with that. And then delegates that are sent to the Electoral College don't have to vote for the person that they were sent to vote for. And we have seen this before. I believe one delegate from Washington in the 2016 election chose not to vote for Hillary and voted for Bernie Sanders. So I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on that, but I think if you look at the 2016 official results, you'll see one Electoral College vote for Bernie Sanders. So that's just kind of where all the stuff with the Electoral College gets muddy.
Thank you for diving in a little bit. That was fun.
So Katie asked, Katie wants to know, do you know of other big decisions that the Supreme Court will determine besides the 1846 abortion law and map boundaries that we should be aware of? Katie came in a little late, so just so you know.
So actually something that before I answer that reminds me, I want to drop in the chat something that it's called guides.vote. It's a super good nonpartisan resource that'll answers a bunch of questions about like where candidates stand on stuff and the implications of certain votes. If you just look up like guides.vote too, it's the first thing that'll come up, but it's great. So really those are like the two big things that they're likely going to vote on are the maps in 2030 and then the 1840s abortion ban. Other than that, I'm not really aware of anything too major that we know we're going to see. I think there's a lot of potential for a lot of lawsuits regarding the 2024 election. Almost undoubtedly that the courts will be ruling on. To be honest, no, I'm not gonna say. I don't really see that becoming like a huge issue. We haven't really seen any Supreme Court justices in Wisconsin have much disagreement on those issues, but it's something that we could, definitely has potential for. The guides.vote talks about it a little bit more too. It's something I don't really know a ton about, but there are a lot of debates over like the status of unions in Wisconsin, which again, admittedly, is something I'm not super familiar with. So if that's something you're really passionate about, you can read about it on that guides.vote. But those are the big things that we currently know are going to come across the Supreme Court's desk. But I mean, nobody saw Roe or abortion bans being this big of an issue 2 years ago. So yeah, with no doubt there will be a lot of big things to come in the next 10 years.
No, if this wasn't your job and you didn't seek out this information yourself, how much of it do you think you would actually know? And do you think that's a problem?
I would say I wouldn't know a lot if this wasn't my job. I mean, this is my job, and I still don't think I know a lot about, especially about like the Supreme Court race. I'm still learning new stuff every single day about like what these candidates' positions are and the kind of stuff that the courts will be ruling on. I definitely think a lack of available information is hands down the biggest problem with our election system overall. That's why I put that guides.vote in the chat. That's an organization that like I'm super passionate about. And like my biggest problem when I was an intern actually in college was like a lot of people just wanted to know something about the candidates, right? It was impossible to find like nonpartisan resources that would portray both candidates equally and fairly. And that the closest thing we had for a long time was the League of Women Voters actually produced some really good information, but they are increasingly seen as partisan more and more. So thankfully, like guides.vote has become a really significant organization recently, especially in the fall election. And it's something that like my organization has been starting to push a lot. But yeah, it's just so if you really just want to like sit down and learn about the two candidates in a not gross manner, with a lot of fighting and mud throwing, it's difficult. And yeah, I think that's a huge problem.
Any other questions? Anyone is burning to ask?
I have a question. Statistically, what age group shows up to the polls most?
Old. Like it's almost like a perfect linear trend from young to old. Like I think when you get into like the 90s, they don't vote quite as much, but like yeah, your 60s and your 70s are some of the biggest voting blocks in terms of voting rates. But for the first time ever this past election, millennials and younger made up the largest voting block for like able to voters, not voters that actually turned out, unfortunately. So yeah, that's kind of my answer to that question. The older you get, the more likely they are to vote. So if you don't want your grandma making political decisions for you, you should vote. Even if you do want your grandma making political decisions for you, you should also vote too. I'm not saying it's a either or scenario, but like, yeah.
All right, well, I just put up on the screen some other upcoming topics. So please make sure you stay tuned. And if any of these other topics interest you in the coming weeks or months, we would love to see you again. But if there are no further questions, and of course, if anyone wants to hang out and ask more, we're happy to hang out. Just want to say thank you to Noah and to Lauren for finding Noah for this evening's webinar topic. I found it fascinating, and I already vote, and I learned so much. So round of applause for Noah there. Thank you very much, sir. Again, if anyone has any other final questions, please feel free to stay and hang out and ask them. Otherwise, the filing your taxes March 23rd, that one's up and you can register today, carrollu.edu/alumni/events, or there are flyers around campus. Otherwise, some other upcoming topics, again, stay tuned. Those will be coming out shortly.
Thank you, Noah. We appreciate